The living water washes away the former things and allows a new thing to flow out of our lives. There has been a lot of talk about turning away from sin, turning away from temptation. There has been a lot of talk about recognizing what is wrong, recognizing what is bad, and turning away from it. But I believe there has to be more talk about recognizing what is right, recognizing what is good, and turning towards what is good and what is right. It is harder to turn away from what is wrong if you don't have something else to turn to. It is harder to turn away from what is bad if you don't have something good to turn to. We need something good to turn to. We need to turn to something that helps us understand the goodness of God. We need the goodness of God pouring into our lives. We need the goodness of God We need the goodness of God flooding into our lives. In the days of Noah, we had the flood of God's judgment. In the days of Christ, we have the flood of God's mercy. We need the flood of God's goodness and mercy. We need God's goodness and God's mercy. Or should I say, we need the goodness of God's mercy coming into our lives. God's mercy is the living water that heals us and transforms us so that we resemble our Father in heaven, so that our hearts resemble God's heart. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who seek the living water that washes away our sins and the sins of those who have sinned against us. The living water washes away the past. The living water washes away the former things. The living water washes away the former things and allows a new thing to flow out of our lives. The living water allows God to make a new thing flow out of our lives because God is working in our heart. Our Father in heaven is pouring His love into our heart so that our hearts resemble God's heart through the love of Jesus Christ. Our Father in heaven is pouring His love into our hearts through the love of Jesus Christ so that we can live lives that reveal that we resemble our Father in heaven. And this is the greatest thing you can live for, to live lives that reveal that we resemble our Father in heaven. There is no greater happiness than this. When you're living a life that reveals you resemble your Father in heaven, there is no greater happiness than this. But here's the problem. The problem is sin. The problem is that sin is attractive. The problem is that sin is initially attractive, but inevitably destructive. The problem is that Satan presents sin as pleasure. Satan presents sin as pleasure. But what he doesn't tell us is that the pleasure is short-lived. He lied to Adam and Eve, and he's been lying to us ever since. And because we believed Satan's lies, darkness came into the world. We turned away from God and turned towards the pleasure offered to us by Satan. We turned to the pleasure offered to us by Satan. And for that short-lived pleasure, we turned away from God. And a world turned away from God is a world of darkness. A world turned away from God is a world in darkness. And people living in a world of darkness are inclined to darkness. People living in a world of darkness are inclined to darkness. And it's so awful. Darkness exists in our lives, in our world, in our lives, because of short-lived pleasures. A short-lived pleasure. What do I mean by a short-lived pleasure? This is what I mean about it. This is what I mean by a short-lived pleasure. After the pleasure, there is darkness. The pleasures of sin are short-lived pleasures. The pleasures of sin, are short-lived. The pleasures of sin are short-lived pleasures. But Satan will never tell you that the pleasures of sin are short-lived pleasures. So here's what you and I have to know. Short-lived pleasures will suck the life out of you. Short-lived pleasures will steal your strength. Short-lived pleasures will make you weak. Short-lived pleasures will make you dysfunctional. And when you are dysfunctional, you are on the road to destruction. And that's what Satan wants. And Satan has succeeded in deceiving so many of us. Really, all of us. A world turned away from God is a world in darkness. And people living in a world of darkness are inclined to darkness. We are inclined to do things that are initially pleasurable, but inevitably destructive. Sin is initially attractive, but inevitably destructive. This is why Satan disguises sin as pleasure. Satan disguises sin as pleasure. But Satan does not tell you that the pleasures of sin are short-lived pleasures. Short-lived pleasures will suck the life out of you. Short-lived pleasures will steal your strength and make you weak. Short-lived pleasures will make you weak. Short-lived pleasures will make you dysfunctional. Short-lived pleasures will lead you to the road to destruction. And since the days of Adam, Satan has succeeded in deceiving us to follow short-lived pleasures that steal our strength, that make us weak, that make us dysfunctional, that lead us to the road to destruction. Jesus came into the world because Satan has succeeded in deceiving us to pursue short-lived pleasures that are initially attractive but inevitably destructive. We follow those short-lived pleasures that make us feel good at first but make us feel awful afterwards. The only one who would perfectly resemble our Father in heaven, the only one who would perfectly resemble our Father in heaven is someone who came from heaven. Jesus came into the world because we live in a world of darkness. Our hearts are influenced and our hearts are affected by a world of darkness. So our hearts are always inclined towards darkness. Our hearts can't help but always turn to darkness. So we needed someone who wasn't from this world to come into our hearts, to come into our lives. We needed someone from heaven. Through the love revealed by Jesus Christ, the light from heaven comes into our lives and turns us away from darkness. The light from heaven comes into our lives and turns us away from darkness. Jesus came into the world so that through the love he revealed on the cross, the light from heaven could come into our hearts, into our lives, and turn us away from darkness. Jesus came from heaven into the darkness of this world so that the light from heaven could come into our lives, so that the light from heaven could come into our lives and replace the darkness in our heart, and replace the darkness in our hearts. So in the desert, when Satan tries to deceive Jesus, Satan could not succeed with Jesus as he succeeded with us. In the desert, Jesus succeeded where everyone else who ever existed has failed. Jesus succeeded because his heart found no pleasure in the pleasures that Satan offered. His was a heart that came from heaven, and a heart from heaven finds no pleasure in the pleasures of this world that lead to darkness. I believe Jesus was fully aware that his love for us and his desire that we have an eternal relationship with our Father in heaven, His desire that we have eternal pleasures, that we experience the eternal pleasures that come by living lives in God's hands, by having our lives in God's hands. That pleasure Jesus had, that desire Jesus had for us, was far stronger than the temptation of the short-lived pleasures that Satan was offering. His desire that we experience the eternal pleasures that come with living lives in God's hands, that pleasure far outweighed the temptation of the short-lived pleasures of what Satan was offering.